And of course, I want to bring in the Mayor of Toronto, John Tory, is with us because, of course, the bigger the city, the more important the strategy around how to reopen. Mayor, thank you for being with us. And I want to start with the plan, such as it stands, that we heard from Ontario, and then kind of backed up by the federal government, which is a very health-led plan, short on specifics, short on target dates. I know it's hard to find anybody who can be critical of that because it's a bit of apple pie and mother's milk to say we're going to wait till the health issues behind us. But there are some economic realities here, and businesses need more certainty than they're getting, is what we're hearing on the other side of it. Where do you come down?
Well, I come down this way. First of all, the reason there aren't any dates in it is because people keep forgetting the first part of Premier Ford's plan, which was to say we need 2 to 4 weeks of declining, new cases of COVID-19 and various other indicators like that before you even get to the first day of phase one. And I think he's, leading up to that a little bit and hoping for those good numbers by allowing some of these businesses to prepare and to get safe and to get healthy, because they're going to have to change the way they do business to some extent. But I also would point out, when people say there's an economic cost to this, and I got from a very senior business leader yesterday quite a, sort of a strongly worded email saying, don't you realize the cost that's being extracted here? And I wrote him back very politely, of course, and said, don't you realize the cost that would be extracted by having a second wave of this come because we didn't reopen the economy properly, and that we were closed down for a longer period of time again? Can you imagine the devastation if we had to go through this again? Pick a month, October or November of this year. It would be a complete disaster as opposed to just a disaster. So I am with Mr. Ford's plan. I think it's just right. It's got the phasing. He's allowing people to do some preparation on the theory that we will get that 2 to 4 weeks of the good numbers that his own plan spells out. And it has to be led by health. This whole thing started because of health. So why would we then just say, well, let's throw all the health stuff out the window and just go for protecting jobs? You've got to achieve that balance, and it has to be a balance. But the balance has to be tipped in favor of health, obviously.
So then tell me where the city stands in terms of the most urgent needs that you're seeing amid this continued lockdown. Where is your attention most focused?
Well, my attention is still focused. I mean, again, I think we have to have a well-planned, well-executed opening. And of course, if you ask me what's the thing that's worrying me the most at the moment, it is, for example, the public transit system. Because as you open back up and as you have more people coming to work, will they be afraid to use public transit? Because it is, by definition, a place where people congregate. How will we control the degree of crowding if it goes back up from today's ridership of 600,000 to 1.6 million on a fully normal day, which I realize we wouldn't get to right away? But how do we regulate that in the interest of good health and not having this, outbreak take place because people were crammed into a subway car? And these aren't necessarily problems that are faced by every city across the, but they are faced by us, and they are the realities. And then after that, there's a whole bunch of practical concerns like that for every single industry. But, because the fact is that while the restaurant people may say, as I heard you mentioning, that it's not viable for them to have every second table occupied for physical distancing reasons, that may be necessary from a public health standpoint. So how do we work that out? And then otherwise, we're just really worried, as we have been throughout this, about how to look after really vulnerable people, because they are here now and they will be here when the pandemic starts to wind down. But we've still got to look after them. And that is a major challenge for us logistically, financially, and every other respect. But I think it's our first obligation is to look after those people and make sure that they're not victimized health-wise or otherwise.
So the really good news is that from what we can gather across Ontario, the city mayors are all aligned. You're all aligned with your premier. So that's good. We don't have alignment between provinces. And obviously the most stark place we see that are between the two biggest and the two hardest hit, Ontario and Quebec. Concerns about cross-border travel, about how one opens while the other one is still being more careful or cautious. How do we address that?
I don't know. I think it would be better if, Quebec and Ontario and all the provinces kind of agreed on a common set of, parameters. And I think this is what the Prime Minister has said. I would also say to you, it would be very helpful if the provinces and the federal government agreed on paying attention to some of the real concerns about cities. And you may say, well, of course, the mayor of Toronto would say that. I think you'd find if you asked any mayor of any city in the country that we have experienced devastating revenue losses from this, as they have too, but they have the capacities created by their own laws. They have the the capacities to borrow and to otherwise use the system to benefit governments, and we don't. We've been deliberately restricted in that regard. And when Toronto, for example, represents 20% of the GDP of the country, then I think it would be in their interest. It would be a great investment for them, too, because, if they invest money in the city of Toronto, the other governments, they're the ones that are going to get that money back through increased HST, through increased income tax, increased corporate taxes. And that's true of Vancouver, Montreal, Calgary, Edmonton. I mean, these are the engines of growth in the country. And I just hope they're having a little dance with each other at the moment. No, it's your fault. No, it's your fault, the federal and provincial governments. I hope they focus in on the fact that the cities need help because they're in desperate straits financially, and that we will be the recovery actually takes place. And I hope they sort that out, too. So it's a matter of provinces agreeing, all three governments being aligned, which so far we have been. So I think it's a need in the recovery to be aligned as well, both in terms of the timetable of the plan, but also in terms of supporting each other.
In your case, you faced a budget hole already because of some clawbacks that you had already budgeted for in terms of money coming from the province. I know there's been some moving parts on that, but what is it that you need? Are you starting to get your arms around a dollar figure or a type of aid
Absolutely.
or transfer that makes most sense?
Yes, well, all the cities in Canada put together all of their anticipated needs and said to the federal government that we need a backstop of $10 to $15 billion in 2020 to cover operating problems the cities have. Toronto's share of that would be probably about $1.5 billion. When people say, how could it be that high? I just say to them, well, for example, we're losing $20 million a week on lost transit revenue. So multiply that out by 10, 20, 30 weeks, however many you want. It's a lot of money. And so we're looking for help from those governments, and we've made that ask as a series of cities across the country, but Toronto has its own needs. We're going to have invested a couple of $100 million in looking after homeless and vulnerable people during the pandemic. So, where does that come from? Because we're not allowed to run a deficit, and I don't want to. I'm not asking for any change in that law. We also have very limited sources of revenue. So these things all have to be looked after, and they're all part of having a healthy city that can get back on its feet, healthy cities across the country, get back on its feet. Our finances were very stable, as were many of the other cities across the country before this happened. And I'm not blaming anybody for that. I'm just saying we have a global pandemic here. Now we got to get the country healthy again, get everybody operating in a city that has proper transit, and that's true across the country, proper child healthcare, proper, parks and roads and police and fire, and that we don't have the means to sort that out ourselves. So it's all part of what I hope is a coordinated program, which we've done very well. I should tell you, the federal and provincial governments have worked with our city, and I think other cities feel the same, to help people first with their liquidity issues, then business, including small business. And now I think it's time to turn to the cities and say, if they're on a sound footing, that will help in a recovery that can be faster and better for all the cities and provinces across the whole country.
All right. Mayor John Tory, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Amanda. Bye-bye.
John Tory is, of course, the mayor of Toronto.